and set that expectation early. Sit down. That needs to be part of every single retiring married couple. Before you retire, you need to sit down and discuss, what does this mean for our relationship? What does this mean for the time that we're spending together and apart?
Well, that was Ben Taatjes talking about the importance of setting and resetting your expectations that come along with the transition of retirement. Hey everybody, Jared Sebesta here on behalf of Ben Taatjes and myself. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Well, retirement is a big life change. We say it all the time. The two most dangerous years of a person's life are the year they were born and the year they retire, all because retirement is such a major and significant transition. You know, life is just a series of transitions. So when it comes to dealing with the inevitable transitions of life, having realistic expectations is the key. In this podcast, Ben Taatjes will talk about resetting your expectations for your relationships in retirement, and he will also explain the reason you should never set your expectations too high. Enjoy this episode. All right, folks, welcome back to the show. Jared Sebesta here joining you on Retire Repurpose. So glad that you're joining us here on the show today. This show is for retirees and pre-retirees. So whether you are retired or not, if you have retirement on the horizon, maybe 1 year, 5 years, 10 years down the road, maybe you're planning for your retirement or in the early stages of that, this is a place where you can find some insight. And we're going to talk about another show today about creating a lot of awareness for you as you make this particular major life transition. And that's what we're going to talk about here on today's show and the days ahead. Resetting your expectations when it comes to going through life's transitions. Again, if you want to hear more from us, a great place to find us is online. Make sure you subscribe and follow our podcast on your favorite podcasting platform. And also, too, go check out Ben's book. You can find out all of this information at our website, retirerepurposed.com. Well, on last week's show, we talked about resetting your table. And Ben Taatjes gave a really interesting example, a really heartfelt example about how he's having to almost reset his table literally in his own home. Ben Taatjes joins me on the show now. And last week's show, again, talking about life's transitions. You're not retiring. We're not retiring, maybe not anytime soon. But you, in many ways, are going through a pretty significant life change in your own home as well with you and your family, right?
Yeah, Jared, I think for me right now, my big transition is a daughter heading to college. And somebody out there probably listening, it's no big deal. I've been through that before. And, people that are in retirement have been through several transitions since, of course, if they had children that went to college. I'm learning from people. I'm talking to people. I'm also trying to apply what I'm reading about this transition in my life and trying to help others as they, go through their life transitions. Mm-hmm. I'm not ready, Jared. If I'm honest, this weekend we were up at the family lake cabin and spending time together, and it was a great weekend. And again, I come back to picturing my life, right, without my oldest daughter as part of my family, mm-hmm. right? So I look around that table, as we talked about last week, and I look at our dinner table, and it's a 4-person table. And now there's 3 people around it. Mm. And a thing that has been helping me is saying I might not be ready today, but getting ready, I've got to start looking at each of the places where each of my family members sit around that table. Mm-hmm. So my youngest daughter, my wife, and I, we're each going to have to move a little bit to our right, a little bit to our left. And we're not going to replace Lauren. We're not going to remove her. She's always got a spot at our table when she comes back. But for the time being, we've got to make adjustments mm-hmm. within our table setting, if you will, so that life goes on, yeah. and we're able to flourish and to live this life through this transition.
It's interesting because transitions happen all the time. I think if we were maybe like keeping score, really life is just a series of transitions. In fact, even as you were explaining that, I'm thinking, like every decade really like baked into just the life experience is a major transition. Like when you're in your teens, you graduate from high school, that's a transition. You get out on your own. There's a decent chance that in your 20s, you're starting a career, perhaps moving. That's a transition. Getting married is a huge transition. Having your first child, massive transition. Now you start raising children, perhaps moving again. There's probably a career change in there. I think most people change careers. I think on average, I want to say like 3 to 5 times, like a major career change. Now you're dealing with empty nesters like you, selling a business, retiring. I mean, just in the last 30 seconds, I just rattled off 7, 8, 9, 10 major life transitions between the ages of 15 and 65 years old. You think we'd be used to this by now, but that's just kind of how life is, and it's just kind of against the human nature that we don't like change, and that's probably why transitions many times seem so difficult.
It's exactly it, Jared. It's the change, right? We're I'm a creature of habit. I'm used to things a certain way. I'm used to my life looking a certain way, and then when you remove a part of it and you go through that transition, you're going to feel angst. You're going to feel uncomfortable. And I think part of it is being okay with that. We talked about last week is like embracing that. So yeah, it doesn't feel right. It feels different. But there's positive to it. There's great things to come. My relationship with my younger daughter is at home. That will change. My other daughter is leaving for college. She's going to change. She's going to walk into this big world. God's got big things in store for her. It can't stay the same. It shouldn't stay the same. So again, all the transitions you talked about, the big transition that we talk about the most on this show, which is retirement, because we know that most people struggle with that one. That's a big kind of, it's not the final transition, but it's a huge transition. Yeah. I would say, bigger than almost anything else we go through in life. And if we can learn from these other transitions and prepare people just a little better, right? We're doing our jobs.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point where you should, I don't want to say want a lot of these transitions to take place, but understand and accept that that's a part of life. And I think if we go through life with the attitude of gratitude and acceptance for the journey that we're on, man, I mean, you grow. And I think with anything, when it's uncomfortable, you use the word uncomfortable. Whenever we're put in uncomfortable situations, whether out of our choice or just life's journey, we grow because of it. And I think that is if you look at it like that, it feels different instead of fighting it. I've always said, when you accept something, there's peace. When you fight it, it just seems like there's discord and dis-ease with that. And that's kind of the same thing here, where you're looking at it as a positive situation.
Yeah, you're onto something. That gratitude piece, Jared. I know that you're a huge proponent of just daily gratitude. I'm trying to do better in that side, I guess. I don't come at life naturally that way. I'm very much like more of a pessimist side of things. But I think switching, kind of flipping that switch in my head to be looking at things from the aspect of, be grateful, right? Look at the time, going back to my transition, the time that we've had with our daughter in our home. Sure. And all the positive things, right? And then all the positive things we would be thankful for, that she's chosen a great college, that just all these positive things. If we start there, it is a big it moves a needle for me. It helps me see this transition as a positive thing, not as a negative change, but a positive one.
Sure. Well, little disclaimer there on my my attitude. That's why I have to bake in gratitude into my day, because I'm kind of the same way. I don't that's not my natural state of emotion in many times, so that's why I have to be a proponent of it, because my propensity for it probably isn't there like other people, including my wife and probably your wife as well. So last week's show was called Resetting Your Table. Go back, listen to that show. Really interesting show, but it does set the stage for the tone of today's show. And moving ahead, we're going to continue down this trail of dealing with life's transitions. And instead of resetting your table, we're calling today's show Resetting Your Expectations. Resetting your expectations. And we're going to kind of go down the relational trail. We're going to talk about different relational biospheres, so to speak, in our life, and how we can adjust or maybe create more realistic expectations in those areas of our life. Ben, you said you were doing a little bit of reading, and there was one particular book that's kind of been striking you lately. Talk about that.
Yeah, I've been reading the book Same as Ever by Morgan Housel, and he wrote a book a few years back. It was a best-selling book, The Psychology of Money. I'd recommend that one too, as well as I think, as in our business, we're always dealing with financial concerns and money, and there's huge psychology behind retirement. We've talked about that on the show many times, the psychology of money and how that plays in. But what struck me, in this current book, The Same as Ever, it's really the title is or the subtitle is A Guide to What Never Changes, right? And I think he does a good job of just talking about different things in life that don't change, different things that if you can understand these basics, it will help you. And one thing I read that kind of hit me this week was, and it might sound funny as we're talking about being optimists, right, and being positive, is the first rule of happiness, he says, is setting low expectations. And it's trying to compare the expectations versus reality. And really what the author's talking about in this specific chapter is how, one of the hardest things to kind of deal with in life is when we set a high expectation for something, we build something up on a pedestal, and then we get there and it's less than what we expected it to be. Okay. So really in this chapter, he talks about most things in the world. If you look at people's, economic situation, health, just many aspects of life have gotten better over time. Like if you compare today's world versus that of one at 50 years ago or 70 or 100 years ago, our health's better. Most people are living better. Disposable incomes are higher, all these things. So, but what Morgan talks about in this chapter is that although the world continues to improve and has been improving overall, happiness has not. Right? And that's largely because of people's expectations. We get used to a certain standard of living, and then we expect more, and we expect better, and your true happiness doesn't really go up.
So it kind of mimics the moving goalposts, same type of thing, same concept that we've talked about so many times in the financial world of retirement. Explain that a little bit more.
Well, the moving goalposts, and Morgan talks about that too in the Psychology of Money book. But it's like you kind of set your goalpost, right? You know that in your mind, once you amass, whether it be $1 million of net worth or $1 million of income or $10 million or whatever that number is, when I get there, I'll be happy, right? When I reach that certain point financially, I'll have made it. The problem is along the way, the goalpost moves. And once you actually get there, you're not fulfilled. You're looking at the next possible thing. The goalpost moved again, and it moved again. So you never actually, for most people, attain that, right? That spot at which you're comfortable. So for a lot of retirees, they're like, well, once I get to have $1 million in the bank, then I'm ready for retirement. And then it's, well, once you get there, it's like, well, things I kind of could use this. Maybe we could go for 2 million or whatever that number is. The goalpost continually moves, right? And I think that the psychology behind this is you kind of set the expectation that you'll be happy or that you will have what you need, but then things change.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Talk about like that with respect to like goal setting. We're not suggesting you shouldn't have a big vision or big goals or try to attain things or retirement or net worth, but really it's the expectation that needs to be maybe couched in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah, I think if you key in on the expectation, setting reasonable expectations for what either the wealth can do for you or your income. Higher income is not going to make you happy. We know that.
Right.
A certain level of income does, but after that point, it actually doesn't. And that's something that they talk about in this book a lot as well. And I think what I want to make sure people hear is don't put retirement on this pedestal that like the expectation is that my life in retirement will be so much better. If you had a life that wasn't fulfilled prior to retirement and then you retire, just because that day you didn't go into work anymore, it will not make your life better. It's not going to solve the problems that you have, right? So I think when we look at expectations, we look at the expectation of retirement or anything for that matter, that it's going to be the silver bullet, the magic pill that solves our life's problems. I think that's when people get into trouble. It's easy to do, Jared. It's easy because in our society today, we tend to put a negative picture all over work, right? It's like work's bad. Once you retire, then you'll be fulfilled. It is in society, it's held out on this pedestal that it will make your life better. And I think resetting your expectations of retirement means don't expect retirement to solve that issue of you not being fulfilled or you having that hole in your life. So I think it's about setting a reasonable expectation for what retirement really is, right? And I think that's where we have to start this discussion.
What I hear you saying too is it's a realistic expectation of how it's going to make me feel. That's kind of, I feel that kind of in between the lines of what you're saying, where if you put this thing up on a pedestal, it's not something that you shouldn't try to attain, but have a realistic expectation how it's going to fulfill me, or lack thereof, perhaps. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Jared, Charlie Munger has a great quote. I pulled this out of that same book we're talking about, where he's talking about him being happy and content. Now, of course, before he died, was one of the wealthiest men. He was a partner in Berkshire Hathaway, working with Warren Buffett, of course. But he says the first rule of a happy life is low expectations. If you have unrealistic expectations, you're going to be miserable your whole life. You want to have reasonable expectations and take life's results, good and bad, as they happen, with a certain amount of stoicism. And I think there's some wisdom in that. Have a reasonable expectation of what retirement is. What is it? It is removing work from your daily activity. That's it. It's not anything more or less than that. It shouldn't be held out as this great, it's a big life transition, right? But it shouldn't be looked at as like, that's the point at which I've arrived. It is simply the day when you are no longer going to work to earn a paycheck, right? And now you have an extra 8 or 10 hours a day of your day back, right? And you need to do something with that time.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because it's giving a realistic viewpoint of what it is and perhaps what it is not. And when you can create some awareness in that, I think that better suits you and prepares you for when the transition actually happens. I think that's a great point. As we talk more about resetting expectations, let's talk about kind of that marital relationship, because this is an area where if those expectations are not set, hopefully prior to retirement, people can get themselves into trouble.
Yeah, I think we underestimate, right, the relational changes that retirement means. And the first one's with our spouses. Jared, I'll never forget a meeting I had early in my career where a husband and wife had just retired. And the husband ended up having to use the restroom midway through our meeting. And we're talking about finances and everything else that goes in retirement. And he gets up to leave. And I can still hear the door click as he left my office, because his wife became a completely different person. And she's talked very freely to me. And she says, Ben, I'm terrified. You know what the absolute scariest thing is? It's not all these numbers. It's not all the stuff we're talking about today. It's I have to spend every waking moment now with that man. And the expectation for her was that he's going to be there every waking moment. And for him, actually, once he came back into the meeting and I started talking about kind of resetting the expectation, was, Mr. Client, again, you need, your wife she was a stay-at-home mom, and she had kind of her own world, right, for years prior to this. And we had to kind of set his expectation, because as he kept talking, it was like, well, we're going to spend more time doing this. We're going to be together this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. And she was feeling suffocated because the expectation for him was like, well, now I'm not at work. I want to be with you, my wife, right? And the problem with that, Jared, is when they were newlyweds, that sounded like a really good idea. Yep. But as we've talked about before, as life happens, right, you're not newlyweds anymore. And now you're spending every minute together with that person. It can create some significant marital problems. Yeah. So again, resetting that expectation was huge for that particular client.
You mentioned how it's important to reset those expectations. For me, this is probably more about realistic expectations with time, more so than perhaps the marital relationship, but it affects the marital relationship probably the most out of any other relationship. For example, as you mentioned, retirement is nothing more than the removal of work. And as we mentioned in previous shows, removing of work it's not like this magical thing that just happens the day that you leave work. It just gave you back your time. Do you think that people really misinterpret or miscalculate how they're going to spend that extra time once they get into retirement.
Yeah, like this gentleman I was just talking about. Like he was expecting now to spend a ton of that newfound time, that 8 to 10 hours of that day, with his wife. Problem was the expectation from his wife was like not quite the same, right? I mean, they get along fine. It wasn't an unhappy marriage, but they both had their own things going, right? So you can't expect that without good communication to work without a problem. So that's why I'm saying set that expectation early. Sit down. That needs to be part of every single retiring married couple. Before you retire, you need to sit down and discuss, what does this mean for our relationship? What does this mean for the time that we're spending together and apart?
That's a great point that needs to be said over and over and over again. Do you also think that people maybe they don't have realistic expectations on how much they're going to spend on their hobbies, for example? Again, the quintessential answer you get, what are you going to do once you retire? I'm going to fish more, I'm going to golf a little more, play a little more pickleball. I mean, the reality is that you can't do that 40 hours a week. Well, maybe some people could, but even if you did, that's just not a sustainable thing. Do you think people really they don't understand just how much time they were spending at work, and now how much time you need to fill up that time with something other than just hobbies and watching TV?
Yeah, I think we underestimate that side of it. And then they think that they're going to be happy doing those activities. Right. Part of the reason you like those activities is because it gave you a break from your work.
You don't have time to do it.
Yeah, exactly. So that actually, does take away from some of the enjoyment for some of these retirees. But I think another thing, Jared, is look at the other relationships that can be really strained here, and that's with children and grandchildren.
Sure.
Right? Some people retiring have this expectation that I'm retiring so that I can just be with my grandkids all the time. And I'm going to be able to pour into my grandkids. And I've heard that, the phrase I've heard a lot is, my grandkids are now my ministry. They're my new life. And I love hearing that. I think the heart is good. The heart is super, that's what we love to hear, is like grandparents with their grandchildren is awesome. But again, you have to come at it from not necessarily like that's your entire life, but that needs to be part of it. And again, set the expectation with your children about how much time you're going to be spending with the grandchildren and how you can best serve them in order to make that really work. And you need to set those expectations early in retirement with your extended family.
So what is reasonable? Like, let's talk reality. Like, a husband is retiring, and now is going to be home more, with his spouse. You're retiring, and now you want your kids and your grandkids to be your life. What, like, in your experience of helping people through this, like, what are some reasonable expectations that people can have or start to kind of set into stone, so to speak?
Well, there is no set in stone or set. Here's what works for most people. Like many things, it's a moving target. It's something that will change over time. But I think the key, Jared, is communication. It always is. It's communicating with your spouse early and often. What's going well, what isn't. How is this different from the expectation that you had set for this retirement time, right? Both with your spouse and your children, those key, most important relationships. I've seen it work where, I've seen grandparents that retire and fill in and become daycare for their young grandchildren. And it works great.
Sure. And
they plug in and they fit a need, and it works great. But I've also seen it where grandparents think that's going to work and it doesn't, right? Because the expectation was, like, I'm going to just take the kids all the time or the grandkids all the time. And it ends up being more of a job than what they expected. Sure. It ends up being not what either the grandchildren or the grandparent really wanted. So again, I think it all comes down to, not a one size fits all, but an individual situation based on good communication with both parties. Get at what, back to that husband-wife scenario we were talking about earlier. What does your wife really want out of this newfound time with you? She probably does want more time with you, but not every waking moment, right? She still wants to be her own person, right? The husband coming into that newfound retirement time, you still need time with your buddies, the things that you got from work, right? With your coworkers, you still need some of that. So you'll need to find places with friends and more community involvement, things like that. But again, you start with setting that expectation, right? And then communicating the expectation really well with all the parties.
This is great. We got about 30 seconds left to get that conversation started. Ben, in your opinion, what's a question, a tangible question that people can ask to get this conversation started?
Jared, it's the greatest question of all time. It's you simply look at it from their point of view. You open the dialogue with something like, hey, this is a big transition. We're going through this retirement. How can I best serve your needs in this transition?
Securities offered through Avantax Investment Services. Member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through Avantax Advisory Services. Insurance services offered through an Avantax affiliated insurance agency.